Thank you all for deciding to spend this time with me during this session at the 2021 Up and Coming Conference being held virtually. My name is Jamila Medley. I'm the Executive Director of the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance, otherwise known as PACA, and I'm also a consultant with Illuminate. This session is called We Have to See It First, the Aesthetics of Whiteness in Food Co-ops. I first offered this topic as a workshop during the 2020 Up and Coming Conference, although it had a slightly different title. It was interactive because we were in with a bunch of participants filling the room. Anyway, the ideas being shared and explored during the session have been with me for years as questions in a lot of ways. My first exposure to food co-ops was in 2012 when I worked at Mariposa Food Co-op in Philadelphia. I was initially hired as the membership coordinator. I worked there for just over 3 years. One of my key observations from that time was that grocery food co-ops, predominantly white spaces, that were welcoming to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC folks. If we could be in the food co-ops in the same way that white folks are. Food co-ops, which are mostly white-led and culturally white-dominant spaces, have a clearly established set of ideals, values, and beliefs, many of which BIPOC folks deeply resonate with. And folks are welcome to be in the co-op if they're willing to get down with how those values, ideals, and beliefs are expressed and operationalized in the co-ops. However, if food co-ops are these community-owned hyperlocal institutions set up to serve its members who live nearby, which in many communities include lots of people who are not white, why do BIPOC, working class and poor, as well as folks from immigrant communities have to do so much work to feel welcomed, to feel like we belong? Over the years in my role as a consultant, through my work with PACA, as a neighbor and friend who also was a member owner of multiple grocery cooperatives, I also know that many white-led grocery co-ops are what Andrew Zitzer describes as the inheritors of a particular set of ethical traditions. He writes that for nearly 200 years, cooperative businesses have worked to change markets and political cultures to be more inclusive and democratic through their focus on collective action. They were also early advocates of food safety and sovereignty in times when adulteration and abuse were rampant. Co-ops deliberate about what to put on the shelves, how to sell it, and to whom it should be sold. In particular, consumer food co-ops wrestle with a paradox of exclusivity, whereby some practices and people are inadvertently left out in order to create conditions for a strong identification among others with particular ways of being and doing. This paradox frequently plays out in the exclusion of people of color, those who cannot afford the co-op prices, and those who are alienated by the co-op's food selection or its organizational practices. I resonate deeply with this framing that Andrew provides. He's a scholar, and we met via Mariposa Food Co-op, where we are both member owners. Considering this paradox of exclusivity, and part of my interest in having this session is to disrupt and reorient the conversations we have about why non-white folks don't shop at or deeply engage in many of our food co-ops. These conversations continuously center on what white folks do to invite others in, while rarely interrogating how assumptions and attributes of race and white supremacy culture actually impede the inclusiveness we want our food co-ops to have. So I'm going to talk about that, as well as this idea of identifying assumptions about and attributes of race and white supremacy culture. I'm going to talk about that during the session, as well as a concept called the aesthetics of whiteness. And this will lead to examining some of the norms and practices that entrench whiteness as neutrality, thus how the aesthetics of whiteness show up in food co-ops. And to end, I'll share a few thoughts on how to address moving beyond what we have now. The work Jade Barker and Patricia Cumby have offered in their Everyone Welcome, Examining Race in Food Co-ops project has deeply influenced my growing curiosity about how race and the food co-op space intersect. I had a chance to participate in that project, and my own narrative is included in the publication. I can't help but think that we begin to learn about how welcome we are as we enter the space of the food co-op. And in reality, I suppose that learning truly starts with word of mouth encounters. What others have told us about the place, what we may have read about or experienced in a similar kind of space, all of those things inform our understanding of whether or not we are welcome. Additionally, how we respond to sights, sounds, smells, textures, and tastes in new environments provide signals to us. In a knowing way becomes our lived experience, right? The signals tell us whether we feel welcome or unwelcome in a place, whether or not we want to go back. I'm curious about how those initial or early shopping experiences with our senses inform people's decision to come back to grocery food co-ops. I'm also curious about how our racialized assumptions and lived experiences under white dominant and supremacist culture impact our experiences as shoppers and consumers within the natural food movements. And so these are the frames that I'm presenting from: our senses, race, class, and the food co-op. So necessarily in this session, per the description, we will be talking about whiteness a lot. And that can make any of us feel vulnerable, uncomfortable, angry, frustrated, hopeful, a little closer to one another, among a myriad of other feelings. So I invite us to bring our observations and awareness about ourselves into this session together. I also want to be clear that this is not an anti-racism training. It is not a Race 101 workshop where we can take a deep dive into concepts, histories, and our feelings about what we believe or not. I ask that together we suspend what Kenneth Jones and Tema Okun in their analysis of characteristics of white supremacy culture articulate as the right to comfort. This session may not feel comfortable for some of you watching. None of us is entitled to learning, growing, and making new ways of being in the world with comfort. As a Black woman working in support of cooperative business development and doing lots of work with food co-ops, I'm not comfortable feeling a need to have to even have this session. Yet here I am doing it because I believe it is important for all of us, regardless of our racialized identities, to have these conversations. So please do what you can to stick through the session as best you can while taking care of yourself along the way. All right. So we really begin now. In 2018, PACA, the organization I work with, participated and collaborated on a project with faculty, students, and staff at Haverford College, as well as social practice artists. The project was called After Work, Seeing Race in Grassroots Economies, and noted that cooperatives have deep historical roots in communities of color, responding to and resisting racial and economic injustice. And yet, as grassroots economies regain momentum in the US, race and class struggles continue to undermine the participation of people of color. While white-led multiracial cooperatives and other grassroots economic organizations say they are committed to racial and economic justice, they often perpetuate abiding forms of racial exclusion. How might these organizations be encouraged to see race and racial injustice, then act differently? Further, how does this racial struggle intersect with the struggle of alternative economies to gain recognition as viable responses to economic injustice? I was fortunate to collaborate with the artists, researchers who developed a project that addressed some of these things in the art world. To get us thinking about this context or food co-ops, we'll watch a brief video called Look at Art, Get Paid. Let me get a full-size version of this ready for us. I'm going to stop my screen share for a second and get us on the same page.
I think people with money, they do museums. They have a certain way, a certain culture. They get into the museum. People in our community, we wasn't taught by our parents, like, go to the museum. It was either go to the library, go to school. We were limited what we could do. And as growing up, I guess it goes from that generation down, and maybe it's because it wasn't advertised. Who knows? I would have never had that opportunity to take my grandson. So maybe he'll remember that, or maybe he wants to go again. And that's something that he can be educated in, and he can teach his family.
Art promises to bring about change, but many art institutions still serve the elite. Museums receive public money to serve the public, but they hear from and answer to the people who show up, a small segment of the population that doesn't reflect the whole. To truly serve the public, museums must understand what their galleries feel like to the demographic majority outside their current visitor base. It turns out, this isn't easy. Free days aren't enough to bring in new voices. Studies show they usually serve people who already visit museums. Beyond the admission fee, a trip to a museum can incur transportation, food, and childcare expenses, alongside the opportunity cost of time diverted from work or leisure. This is a lot to ask, especially if you're not sure what you find in the museum will reflect your lived experience or heritage. Look at Art, Get Paid is an arts research program that pays people who rarely, if ever, go to art museums to visit one as a guest critic. Critics share their time and expertise on what the museum looks and feels like from the perspective of a newcomer. Cash payment ensures that critics leave the museum with a currency that holds value across all intersections of race and class within our capitalist system. The program was created by a small independent group of visual artists and researchers. The first iteration took place at the Museum of the Rhode Island School of Design, a comprehensive art museum in Providence, Rhode Island. Critics were paid with institutional funds from various academic divisions at RISD. The program was advertised in English and Spanish on public buses, and a final 41 participants were selected. Priority was given to those who had never been to a museum, along with people of color. Historically, museums have sought to enlighten and civilize a public. Look at Art, Get Paid asks, how can the museum be enlightened by those who are not presently served by it?
I'm from the North End, and it's pretty isolated. So you come down here, it's really busy, and it seems, the word bougie, I guess. And you come down here, you think, it's just artsy kids, and they're gonna look at you all weird because you got your Jordans on and stuff. But I'd say once you hit Broad Street on a certain side, nobody's really coming downtown to see, because I think the museum, you got to pay $25, $45 to get in, which really isn't the case, but they don't know, so they're not going to look to go down that avenue.
I lived in Providence good 40 years, and I never knew this was a museum, and I come by this street a lot.
So I never felt like, oh, okay, I guess it's not necessarily not a public space, but maybe it's just not a space for me.
I'm really glad that I did come today because I was like, I never knew. And there was a picture by Jean Metzinger over here, and there wasn't enough big paper to see all the things I've seen with that one photograph, but I will take a picture and send it to Walgreens and put it in my living room and post-it. That picture just kept calling me.
I'd get closer to some of the pieces, I'm like, stupid tea kettles thing or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, what the hell is this? And then I'm like, wow, there's such cool little, art in this. And I'm like, maybe it's not something that I would have bought or something like that, at the time or even now, but as a tea set, but as a piece of art, it would be something cool.
And then there's just another thing that I did ask one of the guards. That table, I'm sure a lot of you liked it, that's out there. I asked him if you could if anybody, there's rich people that might come to the museums and have a lot of money. And I said, if I ever win the Powerball, I'm coming to get that table. So I asked him, can you purchase any of the displays? And he said no. But you know, when you got money, I'll work around that. Just saying.
The first thing that happened to me was I went and set off an alarm. I wasn't even doing anything. I just like was looking. I was leaning too far, and the alarm goes off, and I'm like, oh my god.
I just am so afraid that I'm going to do something wrong. Like, I don't want to mess with anybody's art. I don't want to break anything. I don't want to be disrespectful. So I'm really hesitant to like interact with things unless I get something telling me like it's okay.
Because I really didn't see like a lot of inner city people here. Only just like people who, you know, can afford pieces like this in their house or go to these schools. If like somebody who came here, you know, just Spanish speaking, they wouldn't know where to go or like what any of the descriptions were saying. And I felt like, oh, you know, that could have been me or anyone.
Because I was just looking at them, I like it or I don't like it, and then I stopped to read them. And once I read them, I actually liked it a lot more. Yeah. So the more I read, the more I understood, the more I enjoyed.
Te capto el nombre y la fecha, pero se supone que es algo histórico que por eso está aquí, pero eso no lo puedo captar.
Encuentras el autor, encuentras el título, pero cuando vas al año, tú te confundes porque el autor tiene un año, el título tiene otro año, y cuando tú lees la historia tiene otros años, tú dices en cuándo se hizo.
Tú sabes, si tuviera como ciertas palabras clave, hasta en inglés, uno podría deducir. Ajá, aunque fuera en inglés, pero que uno puede deducir que es por el poco idioma que uno...
Claro.
O no sé si es que el museo está dirigido a otro tipo de persona.
For my personal home culture, no, there was no like representation.
Same.
Because I'm Afro-Caribbean and I didn't see much African art, and I did not see any Caribbean art or even Caribbean artists really being represented. So for me, if I were to go to a museum and I see that stuff, that automatically excites me and stuff. But
I didn't see any. I'm Cuban, so I didn't see any neither Mexican or Central American.
I'm Dominican, and I would have loved to see anything Spaniard or Latin American.
Yeah.
Heck, I would have been happy with seeing something even from Brazil. I understand that, you know, like sometimes it can come down to the cost, but it feels weird given that Rhode Island has such a high population of Latin American culture that there's very little representation, but yet constantly there's this talk of, you know, everyone's equally represented, or hey, we're all for equality. I think it has to start with art. Art is like our most intimate expression of who we are as people, and I'd love to see just more international work, period.
It was just like an everyday thing for me. I'm going outside, I walk up the street, and I see tags on the floor, on the ground. I'll see tags on a mailbox, and it's just, who is that? What are they about? You know, their street credibility, so to speak. And it's just, going through a museum, it's the same thing. How highly regarded is this artist? Even looking down there's graffiti right there, and you can just see it on the wall, and you can just go down the stairs or, you know, look at high art, I guess. And it's just, who dictates where art should be?
And here are your 2 guest passes.
$75 is a lot of money to serve people. I mean, even now, you can get a lot with $75, but at the end of the day, there are paintings that cost $15 million or a painting that'll cost $25 million, and then they're sitting right in front of you, and it's just puts things into perspective.
To help me like get to the next point in my life, to be able to move forward and just, you know, have some extra cash in my pocket, whereas I really needed it at the time.
Tal vez si no me ofrecen que me van a pagar, tal vez no vengo. Pero después que estoy aquí, como no la pasamos bien, no podemos escapar.
Most museums were built and curated under white leadership and center white narratives of history, value, and beauty. The RISD Museum's mission states, "We aspire to create an accessible and inclusive environment that builds meaningful relationships across all communities." An overwhelming majority of critics said they were moved by their visit to the museum, and yet their sense of belonging was limited by the museum's collection and the cultural standards of the space. The creators of the project are working to communicate the critiques of the museum to those in power. They are also seeking collaborators and partners to connect to the larger community of artists, activists, and museums working to effect structural change in art and its institutions.
All right. I'm curious and invite you all to consider what, if anything, about the experiences of the critics resonates with you. The people who typically utilize the museum don't reflect the whole community. How might consumer-owned grocery cooperatives be enlightened by those who aren't primarily served by them? A sense of belonging is limited by the collection and the cultural standards of the space. Where is a place that you feel something about you doesn't belong? Where are you afraid to do something wrong or afraid to interact with things? I invite you to take a moment to reflect or jot down your initial feelings, connections, questions, or observations of the film, the project. What are your initial reactions to it? Please feel free to push pause and take a couple of minutes to do your reflection, maybe even writing down some thoughts. Okay. While we are zooming in on a racialized lens in our time together, it's important to acknowledge that race isn't a standalone category and that people experience oppression and subjugation at intersections of their identity too. It's not always easy to identify that race was the singular point at which you felt discriminated against. Sometimes it's the confluence of race, class, gender, and nationality. If you are a poor immigrant woman from Central America in the United States, for example, these oppressions don't always work in isolation. So while this session centers race, it is not the only one that needs interrogation. That being said, for the next few minutes, I'm going to share some definitions and explanations of concepts so that we can have some shared language and understanding to ground this session in. Historically, our society has thought about race as the idea that the human species is divided into distinct groups on the basis of inherited physical and behavioral differences. In truth, race has no genetic reality. It is not biologically determined. Not one characteristic, trait, or gene distinguishes all members of one so-called race from all members of another so-called race. Genetic studies in the late 20th century refuted the existence of biogenetically distinct races, and scholars now argue that races are cultural interventions reflecting specific attitudes and beliefs that were imposed on different populations in the wake of Western European conquests beginning in the 15th century. As Professor Evelyn Hammond states in the film Race, the Power of an Illusion, race is a human invention. We created it, and we have used it in ways that have been in many, many respects quite negative and quite harmful. That's because the concept of race was created as a classification of human beings with the purpose of giving power to white people and to legitimize the dominance of white people over non-white people. Whiteness has unfolded over centuries through process and action. Whiteness has been explained as something achieved. We can think about this in the context of the story of non-Anglo-Saxon European immigrants to the United States. Various groups of Europeans, Irish, Italians, those from Eastern European countries faced a lot of discrimination and struggle to become identified as white. The desire for whiteness is connected to the fact that it provides structural advantage and involves cultural practices that have come to be understood as normal, accepted. We'll talk more about this as it pertains to food co-ops as we go. So we also need this understanding of what white supremacy culture is, because it's the dominant culture in the United States. White supremacy culture is the idea that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color in their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. Naming that white supremacist culture exists is not saying that all white people are white supremacists. No. Rather, naming it acknowledges that all of us, regardless of our racialized identity, are being harmed by, or impacted by, and live every day in a culture that not only assumes, but actuates and promotes through systems and institutions that the closer to white something or someone is, the better it is. And that harms us all. An expression of white supremacist culture is the aesthetics of whiteness, which John King, in an article from the Michigan Journal of Race and Law called Deconstructing the Ideology of Whiteness, he says that the aesthetics of whiteness is a belief that the physical racial features of white Americans are seen as objectively more appealing and universally true than whereas the physical racial features of people of color are seen as subjective and deviant. The ideology of the aesthetics of whiteness allows the dominant group, in this case white people, to use certain assumed beliefs of aesthetic inferiority to justify their subordination of people of color. The ideology is a set of implicit ideas, including unconscious ones that people of all races use to make sense of, among other things, social hierarchy and cultural differences. Julia Guthman's paper, If They Only Knew, Colorblindness and Universalism in California Alternative Food Institutions, explores whiteness and alternative food movements, namely farmer markets and CSAs. Like food co-ops, these kinds of institutions are usually thought of as being white spaces. Guthman identifies two manifestations of whiteness that reproduce harm in alternative food spaces: colorblindness and universalism. Colorblindness, or the absence of racial identifiers in language, are seen as non-racist. However, it does its own violence by erasing the violence that the social construct of race has wrought in the form of racism. Inversely, colorblindness erases the privilege that whiteness has bought. In my own reflection, I think colorblindness promotes exclusivity by not naming that people's racial identities provide positive meaning to them too. By not explicitly naming or otherwise offering cues about who co-ops want to invite in, they fail to extend the invitation. Whether it's by not selling certain food products, not asking for demographic information on member surveys, co-ops lose out on opportunities to let non-white folks know that they are welcome and belong. What this actually assumes is that there is a universal normal or neutral experience that member owners and shoppers have with the co-op. A race-neutral co-op is an unwelcoming co-op. This addresses the second manifestation of whiteness Guthman references, universalism. This is an assumption that values held primarily by whites are normal and widely shared. In alternative food spaces, including food co-ops, it can take the form of an aesthetic ideal that is not obviously racist, but is predicated on white cultural practices. This move erases difference in another way by refusing to acknowledge the experience, aesthetics, and ideals of others, with the pernicious effect that those who do not conform to white ideals are justifiably marginalized. In other words, when particular seemingly universal ideals do not resonate, it is assumed that those for whom they do not resonate must be educated to these ideals or be forever marked as different. It is not lost on me, though, that these types of manifestations of whiteness are so prolific in food co-ops because of who these food co-ops are designed for. We've seen publications in our sector that double down on a belief that, and I quote, "A natural food co-op store has its greatest appeal to people who are better educated, with incomes that are above average, and with occupation types that are health, education, arts, and sports related. To the greatest extent possible, the co-op should be situated in the midst of such targeted demographics," end quote. This statement is a heightened example of the universalistic and colorblindness, yet painfully exclusive and unintentional whitewashing of grocery cooperatives. It tells us who it is for, affluent white folks, without naming. We all know who is meant and prioritized. even though it's not an intentionally racialized statement of experience. Rachel Slocum offers that community food has thrived on a culture that has been made white. How this food is produced, packaged, promoted, and sold engages with a white middle class consumer that base with a white middle class consumer base that tends to be interested in personal health and perhaps environmental integrity. White, wealthier bodies tend to be the ones at co-ops. Here, whites come together, stick together, and then become impenetrable to others despite their desires to be otherwise. While the ideals of healthy food, people, and land are not intrinsically white, the objectives, tendencies, and strategies, the emphases and absences, and the things overlooked in community food make them so. I have been a part of food co-ops for nearly a decade. Yet based on my own experience, it has only been within the last 3 to 4 years, intersecting with this explosion of more food co-ops being started in majority Black working class and poor urban neighborhoods, expanding and starting in multiracial and multi-class neighborhoods. And as food co-ops in more white rural communities see increases in populations from immigrant communities, that our sector has really started to do the uncomfortable grappling required to disrupt white supremacy culture in our food co-ops. Yet just about all of our guidance on how to make grocery cooperatives sustainable, welcoming, and successful is derived from decades of experience supporting white-led co-ops. So what do we do? Grocery cooperatives are also operating in the most competitive environment as co-ops have lost dominance in the natural food and organic food movement. How do we grow our co-ops to be inclusive, welcoming, people-oriented hubs while competing for shoppers with high prices in a broken for us industrialized food system? There are many answers. We presume that maybe there are many strategies for how to get there. I'll share that my own experience encourages me to offer that while a cooperatively owned grocery store in your neighborhood may be a new thing, the co-op model and cooperative economic models are not new. Engage the various histories of cooperative economic practices in the telling of your co-op story. Cooperation isn't new to any of us. Ensure that the stories of cooperation you tell are not only white, and stop starting the story of cooperation with the Rochdale pioneers. No doubt, those 1844 efforts are deeply important to the global legacy of the co-op business model, and it is not the only story to tell. I also encourage us to engage and study about how cooperatives have shaped communities of color in their experiences in the United States. For example, do a study group on Jessica Gordon Nemhart's Collective Courage, a history of African-American cooperative economic thought and practice. Food co-ops have played a vital role in feeding Black communities before and now. This isn't new. Remember that the primary distinction between a co-op enterprise and a traditional business is the association of people and how they choose to relate to one another. Organizing is an essential tool for sustaining a co-op that centers the association of people. It's not organizing just at the beginning to attract equity, but organizing to learn, know, and become with the community in the beginning and perpetually. Be intentional about your leadership. Time and again, I have been asked by startup food co-op groups, led by lovely white people, what to do now that they've created a culture and story about their co-op that doesn't include many groups of people that also live in their neighborhood. They want to now invite people in. If you can, stop right now. Don't keep moving forward without the other people in the community not represented in your co-op. That's a lot to ask, and I don't expect that many co-ops can afford to stop. I just really wish folks stopped moving fast and really decided to go together instead. There's so much more to share and so many more opportunities. I'm going to end this session by sharing a video that I think was recorded probably in 2014 or 2015 with Andrew Zitzer, who I mentioned at the top of this session, along with Esteban Kelly, who, in addition to the roles you'll hear about in the video, is also currently the executive director at the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, a former co-worker of mine at Mariposa Food Co-op, and we both served on the board of directors at the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance together for many years. So I invite you to listen to this conversation. It will take you a little bit beyond the time frame for this session, so feel free to pause it, come back and watch later. But I think it really deals with this idea of the paradox of exclusivity and provides some additional really great opportunities to think about more strategies and more approaches to really begin to dismantle what we've been identifying as this aesthetic of whiteness. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen and participate in this session. I really hope that we are all gleaning learnings together as we do this journey of developing cooperative systems for getting our basic and shared needs met in so many different ways. So thanks again.
Hi, my name is Andrew Zitzer. I'm a professor at Drexel University in Philadelphia, and I have an article in an upcoming issue of Antipode called Food Co-ops and the Paradox of Exclusivity. And this short video is going to be a little conversation about that and some related issues. And I'm joined here by my friend Esteban Kelly.
Hi, yes, I'm Esteban Kelly, and I work with AORTA, which is the Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance. I'm also a longtime member of Mariposa Food Co-op and a former worker there. And I'm a board member with the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance.
Thanks for coming today.
Yeah.
So I wrote this article about the paradox of exclusivity and this issue of food co-ops, and we're going to go a little back and forth and talk about your real-world experience working in co-ops and supporting co-ops, and my experience being a member owner of co-ops, but also trying to write about them from a scholarly perspective. So in this article, I think I came up with some way of phrasing this, at least that's novel, this idea of a paradox of exclusivity, that co-ops, in order to gel and stay together, need to have some kind of sense of group affiliation, something that binds people so that it's not just when the next great grocer opens up down the street, they'll flock there, but something that makes them feel particularly welcome in this place. But if they go too far, the co-ops, in that direction, they run the risk of excluding people and being so specific in their cultural reference points or in their food that people just don't feel like it is for them, or they feel maybe like it's too much for them, and when people who are different from them start to approach the co-op, they don't feel that they're welcome. And the paradox, as I'm calling it, I think has three dimensions.
Okay.
The dimensions are certainly around food, because food co-ops at least lead with food. And when the food is extremely expensive or very culturally specific, there are people who feel quite alienated. The second area is that the way that co-ops market themselves often comes from, with the food and other kinds of elements of the overall identity of the stores, there are people who feel quite alienated. The second area is that the way that co-ops market themselves often comes from, with the food and other kinds of elements of the overall identity of the stores, and those can also sort of refer to people in very specific inclusive and then subsequently exclusive language. And then finally, the business practices at co-ops can be somewhat confusing or alienating to people who haven't encountered the co-op before, whether it's things like weighing your own produce and dry goods, or having to work at the store in order to have the privilege of member ownership. People who don't feel used to co-ops in this way can suddenly feel that the co-op is not their store. So that's the basic idea behind the piece that I put together, and your thinking in your work has certainly helped to inform my thinking, and I wanted to hear if you could talk a little bit about your work in this world, and if you see these kind of in-group, out-group, exclusive and inclusive dynamics operating.
Sure. Well, through AORTA, as you know, we've done a lot of consulting and support for food justice efforts, a lot of food sovereignty education. and directly supporting a lot of different food co-op startup, expansion, and just organizing and development and redevelopment efforts. And we've worked with a wide range of food co-ops. Some of them are worker-owned. Some of them are different kind, not necessarily grocery co-ops, but bakeries and things like that. And then a lot of the groups that we have worked with are grocery cooperatives that are really community-based, especially in low or mixed income communities and multiracial neighborhoods. So that's a lot of the work that we bring to the food justice work. In terms of your question of what I see as some of the challenges are in that organizing, I think it gets really down to fundamental societal questions of what does it mean to live in a democratic, multiracial society where you have people from different class backgrounds. And in some ways, due to the historical legacies of segregation, we're still figuring some of that stuff out, where people are coming together not through the sort of cold alien environment of you walk into a store, you have a business transaction and you leave, but what does that look like when there's a different dimension where people are expected to have some sense of community or to know each other's names, or where there's an opening where you can actually have input as to what the mission is of that grocery store, how it functions, what kinds of products they carry, and what sort of processes they use when they're engaging their membership, which is the fundamental principle of cooperatives, not just that it's owned by the community, but that it's run by the community at a certain level. And so that always has a cultural dimension to it. So I think some of the challenges that a lot of the groups that I've worked with through Aorta, and even in my own experience, being a member of several different grocery cooperatives around the US, come down to that fundamental fact that people are walking in with in a lot of ways, different backgrounds and experiences with everything from community organizing to what their relationship is to their food, even the idea of food literacy, and being able to make their implicit values, the cultural values that they were raised with, explicit enough. The very act of doing that is coded in terms of class background and education levels. That it's not always something that people are very aware of, to be able to disclose and say, oh, here's how my ethnic background relates to the kinds of food that I eat, and here's how I communicate that to our management structure or our buyers or our marketing and outreach campaign of what I want to see in my neighborhood grocery store. So those are some of the challenges. I think also there's challenges in the organizational structure of the groups themselves. Oftentimes you're dealing with a very professional industry, right, in terms of grocery retail, and that doesn't necessarily coincide with a community organizing background. So what we saw at Mariposa was that our success in engaging the community, and it didn't, there's no magical grocery store that has fully overcome these paradoxes and challenges, but we did achieve relative success, and a lot of that was because we had a core group who had community organizing backgrounds and were deeply rooted in principles of food justice from the outset, and then decided to invest their time in our organization, in our cooperative, and in the effort that we were going through to really engage the community and open up our cooperative and overhaul our policies and do a lot of different things to overcome the paradox of exclusivity.
And when you go out into the field working with the communities that bring Aorta in, are there processes that you can depend on and things that you have as your toolkit that you support them in developing that can overcome some of these challenges?
Yeah, a lot of it relates to fundamental principles of community organizing, right? So being self-aware and helping groups to do a certain amount of trust building, understanding who they are and what drives and motivates them, why they're invested in the cooperative that they're organizing, and to be able to bring that self-awareness to a broader level of who are you engaging with on the other side of that. What's your understanding? What's your history with the community that you're in? And if there are overlapping or intersecting communities, how can we get an understanding of that, whether that involves trainings or even sometimes study groups, as a lot of community organizing comes down to around issues of class, issues of race, issues of even gentrification in a lot of cases, and how that relates to food, what motivates people, and how important it is to bring a level of nuance to that community organizing instead of seeing different communities as a monolith in terms of race or class for that matter. But to be able to see what's the role of youth of color in this neighborhood, what's the role of elderly people who have community gardens, what's the role of immigrant communities who are growing their own herbs and who might have their own interest in engaging in this project, right? So being able to get to do an assessment and an understanding to prepare yourself internally before reaching out to the other, and to just constantly remember that that's a really humble process, to put yourself out there and to lead with questions and to lead with listening and be prepared to hear answers that you weren't necessarily expecting when you ask people what they want in their local grocery store, or what they want to see in their community, or what relationship they want to have as neighbors. And sometimes it's hard for people to even begin with those as the questions, as opposed to what will it take for you to be a member? Right. What kind of member will you be? Please sign up and be involved. I think that being able to really back it up a step and understand that the fundamental thing for community organizing is relationships. That's what we mean by organizing. It's about how do you dig down to that level where people connect with one another, whether that's one-on-one or as groups and cohorts of people. And through the relationship, once that connection is there, you can then sort of build on that foundation and create a tremendous amount of power. And once you come out on the other side of that, the prospect of engaging people to run for your board, to even apply for different positions or advertise by word of mouth, whether it's membership, job opportunities, or even to sort of invest enough to put your voice out there and say, we want to see something change in this cooperative, that it's much easier for that to happen if you've laid that groundwork.
Right. And that's really where the article itself ends, is on this notion of reflective practice and inventory internally so that people will overcome this paradox or this dialectic around exclusivity. And the only thing I would add to the wisdom that you're bringing to the practice is just that the cooperatives have this in their business model. Yeah. This is not something that co-ops have to overcome. When we talk about these sort of social enterprise businesses, the idea is, well, we're overcoming the profit motive in order to do social good. Cooperatives believe inherently in concern for community, democratic membership, control, and education. And so if co-ops just hew really closely to their founding values and hold those principles close and act on them, then I think this paradox of exclusivity becomes a non-issue, and we can sort of reintegrate what it means to be a cooperative and really have a transformational gesture towards food, but whatever sector people are able to do social cooperating based on overcoming or at least grappling with those fundamental social problems that we've all inherited and we all reproduce constantly.
Yeah, and I think that the cooperative principles provide a scaffolding to be able to grapple with those societal problems in a way that that has promise for overcoming them, for really addressing things that haven't been able to be solved, always through sweeping policies or forced integration, but to really get down at that level of where are your values and principles and how are you enacting that through democracy, through sharing, through solidarity, through concern, through education, that being able to do that. So it's not quite enough to simply go insular within co-ops and co-op principles and sort of root down and hope for a solution. I really do think that it involves a certain amount of opening up and reaching out for wisdom that rests in the community and in histories of community organizing, and inserting that into the cooperative model and principles and organizing, I think can yield really important outcomes for really growing the movement and making co-ops much more meaningful for the people and the communities that they're really trying to engage and empower and resource.
Well, I thank you for the work that you're doing. It's very meaningful to me, and it's the inspiration for me to want to write about this work and to participate in this work, because it's not just about a transaction where I go and I get the kohlrabi and I leave. This is really about making my world a healthier place in every way. And so I thank you for talking to me today, and I thank you for continuing to do this work that you're doing with your communities, that you have been part of, and more to come.